People always assume betrayal arrives with shouting or slammed doors or some dramatic announcement, but mine arrived quietly on a Tuesday afternoon, with the sound of a suitcase wheel scraping against my front porch and my son's voice saying casually from the doorway, like he was asking for a glass of water, "Mom, we're home. This is our new place now." And I remember standing there with a dish towel still in my hand, trying to understand how a sentence that simple could make my chest feel hollow, like the air had been pulled straight out of me, because no one had asked me anything, no one had warned me, no conversation, no discussion, no respect. Just my grown son, his wife, and 3 full suitcases already halfway inside the house I had paid off with 32 years of factory shifts, double weekends, skipped vacations, and a spine that still aches when it rains. And I wish I could tell you I spoke up right then, but I didn't, because mothers like me were trained not to. We were trained to swallow first and ask later, trained to believe love means accommodating, even when it costs you your dignity. And my son knew that. He knew it because he grew up watching me bend until bending felt normal. And his wife? She smiled at me, polite but distant, already scanning the living room, the furniture, the walls, the space, like someone mentally rearranging a place that was never theirs. And that was the first thing I noticed. Not the bags, not the audacity, but the way she looked past me like I was part of the decor, something old, something already decided. And I told myself it was temporary. I told myself they were struggling, newly married, prices high, jobs uncertain. I told myself a good mother helps and doesn't keep score. But that was before the first night, when they stayed up past midnight, laughing loudly, while I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to my own house feel unfamiliar. Before the second day, when my kitchen cabinets were reorganized without a word, and my coffee mug, the chipped blue one I've used for 10 years, was pushed to the back because it didn't match the aesthetic. Before the third day, when my son started locking the bathroom door I'd never locked in my own home, and said casually, "Privacy, Mom," like privacy was something I had forfeited by giving birth. And by the fourth day, I realized they weren't visiting. They weren't transitioning. They weren't asking. They had decided. And decisions made without you about your own life always carry a certain violence, even when spoken softly. And what hurt most wasn't the space. It wasn't the noise. It wasn't even the entitlement. It was the way my son spoke to me differently, like I was suddenly an inconvenience instead of the woman who packed his lunches, who stayed up sewing his Halloween costumes, who sold her wedding ring when he needed braces. And I noticed how his wife corrected me when I spoke to him, how she answered questions meant for me, how she suggested changes to the house, like repainting my bedroom or maybe converting it into a shared office later. Later being a word that assumes permanence. And by midweek, my name was no longer attached to anything in my own house. It was our fridge, our living room, our rules. And I started eating dinner earlier just to avoid sitting across from them while they planned their future out loud as if I wasn't a variable, as if I wasn't sitting right there. And every night I went to bed feeling smaller, wondering when exactly my life had shifted from being lived to being accommodated by others. And that's when the first twist happened. Not loud, not dramatic, but subtle and dangerous. Because on Thursday morning, I overheard a phone call I wasn't meant to hear. My son speaking quietly in the hallway saying, "No, she doesn't know yet, but she'll come around. She always does." And that sentence cracked something open inside me, because I realized in that moment, this wasn't impulsive. This wasn't desperation. This was strategy, and I was the resource, not the mother. The house, not a home, but an asset. And suddenly, every swallowed word, every forced smile, every ignored boundary lined up into a pattern that made one thing painfully clear. They didn't just move in without asking. They planned to stay, and they planned to push me out slowly enough that I'd blame myself for leaving. And I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, feeling something unfamiliar rise in my chest. Not anger, not sadness, but clarity. The kind that arrives right before everything changes. Because when you finally see the game, you stop playing your assigned role. And by the end of that week, I would no longer be the quiet, accommodating mother in the background of my own life. But they didn't know that yet. They were still laughing, still rearranging, still assuming. And assumptions are dangerous things, especially when the person you underestimate has nothing left to lose. By Friday morning, I stopped crying in the shower and started listening instead. Because once you realize you've been reduced to a convenience, the smartest thing you can do is gather information quietly. And I learned more in 2 days of silence than I had in months of pretending everything was fine. I learned my daughter-in-law spoke to her mother every night, whispering plans about fixing the house and eventually renting it out. I learned my son had already changed his mailing address without telling me. I learned they were arguing in low voices about how long I would last before I got emotional and decided to leave on my own. And what stunned me wasn't the cruelty, it was the confidence, the absolute certainty that I was predictable, weak, manageable. And that confidence only exists when someone has benefited from your silence for too long. And that's when I stopped cleaning up after them. I didn't announce it. I didn't confront anyone. I simply stopped replacing the paper towels they burned through like water, stopped buying the snacks my son liked, stopped refilling the gas in the car he had quietly started using without permission. And when the fridge emptied faster than expected and no magical refill appeared, I saw the first flicker of irritation on my daughter-in-law's face, like a mask slipping for half a second before she corrected it and smiled too sweetly and asked if I'd been feeling okay lately. And that question told me everything, because concern is never the first response when control starts loosening. And later that afternoon, she sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where I once helped my son practice spelling words, and she spoke slowly, gently, like I was fragile, saying they were just worried about me being alone too much, about my health, about the house being a lot to manage at my age. And that's when I realized they weren't just occupying space, they were laying groundwork, narratives, documentation, concern. Concern is the most polite weapon people use before they take something from you. And I nodded and thanked her, because the best way to survive someone underestimating you is to let them keep doing it. And that night, while they slept, I pulled out the folder I hadn't opened in years, the one with the deed, the insurance, the will, the bank statements, everything with my name on it alone. And I read every line carefully, because ownership is power, but only if you remember you have it. And that's when I noticed something small, something they clearly hadn't checked. A clause buried deep stating that any long-term occupancy without written agreement could legally be considered trespass after a certain period. And my hands stopped shaking for the first time all week, because suddenly the house felt like mine again. Not emotionally, not nostalgically, but legally. And people like my son and his wife don't fear emotions, they fear paperwork. And over the next 2 days, I made phone calls, quiet ones. I spoke to a lawyer friend of a friend I haven't seen in years who owed me a favor from a time I watched her kids for free during night shifts. And she confirmed what I suspected, that I had far more leverage than I was being made to believe. And leverage is something you don't reveal until the moment it hurts most. And by Sunday morning, my son finally snapped about the lack of groceries, about the silence, about how I seemed off. And I looked at him, really looked at the man he had become, standing in my kitchen, demanding comfort like it was still his birthright. And the thought didn't soften me, it hardened me. Because children grow, but entitlement only grows when fed. And I told him calmly that I was tired, that I needed space, that I'd be staying with a friend for a few days. And the relief on their faces was immediate, too immediate, because they thought they'd won. They thought this was the beginning of my quiet exit. And as I packed a small bag, I let them believe it, because sometimes the cleanest revenge is letting people relax before the floor drops out. And I left the house that afternoon, not in defeat, but in preparation, because by the time I returned, Everything they assumed was permanent would be very publicly temporary, and the story they were telling about me being fragile would collapse under the weight of one undeniable fact. I was done being convenient. And once a woman like me decides that, everything changes, whether her children are ready or not. I returned on Wednesday morning, earlier than expected, deliberately earlier because surprises only work when the other side feels safe, and I walked into my own house with a calm I hadn't felt in years, carrying not bags, but documents. And when my daughter-in-law saw me, she froze, just slightly, because confidence evaporates fast when it meets certainty. And I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't cry. I simply sat at the dining table and asked them both to join me. And my son laughed nervously, asking what this was about, and I told him gently that it was about boundaries and timelines and ownership. Words he hadn't expected from the woman he'd already mentally relocated out of his life. And I slid the papers across the table slowly. The deed, the clause, the letter drafted by my lawyer explaining occupancy limits, and the formal notice that gave them 14 days, not to argue, not to negotiate, not to guilt, but to leave. And the room went silent except for the sound of my daughter-in-law's breathing, speeding up as she read and reread the words, realizing concern had failed, manipulation had failed, and now reality had arrived. And my son's face changed, not into anger, but disbelief, because the hardest thing for a child like him to accept was not losing the house, but losing control over the narrative he had rehearsed. And he started talking fast about family, about loyalty, about how people would see me if I did this. And that's when I said the thing that ended everything. Calmly, evenly, without heat. I said, "You already decided how people would see me when you moved in without asking, when you planned to rent my home, when you spoke about me like an obstacle instead of a mother." And he tried to interrupt, but I held up my hand, and for the first time in his life he stopped, because authority doesn't shout, it stands. And I told them I wasn't throwing them out, I was reclaiming myself, that help is not surrender, that love is not ownership, and that being a parent does not mean becoming smaller so your children can feel bigger. And my daughter-in-law finally spoke, accusing me of betrayal, of choosing paperwork over people. And I smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. And I told her, paperwork is what people respect when they stop respecting you. And by the time they left the table, they knew there was no appeal, no audience, no drama that would save them. And the next 2 weeks were quiet, colder than before, but controlled. And I watched them pack the same suitcases they'd arrived with, this time slower, heavier, because entitlement makes things feel lighter until it's taken away. And on the last day, my son stood in the doorway, looking confused, like someone whose childhood script had been torn up, and he asked me quietly why I didn't fight harder sooner. And I answered, honestly, because I thought being patient would teach you gratitude, but all it taught you was that I would tolerate anything. And when the door closed behind them, the house didn't feel empty, it felt returned. And people ask me now if I regret it, if I miss him, if it was worth it, and I tell them this. I didn't lose a son, I lost an illusion, and what I gained was my voice, my peace, and a life where love is offered freely, not demanded. And the truth is, by the end of that week, everything changed, not because they left, but because I finally stayed fully present in my own life. And once you do that, no one ever moves in without asking again.